This is Talk with Audrey. Welcome back. The latest research from McKinsey Company revealed that the majority of Americans are introduced to the workplace through frontline jobs. Now, whether they're waiting tables, stocking store shelves, or folding clothes, roughly 112 million Americans are frontline employees, and more than 70% of Black and Hispanic Americans in the U.S. are considered frontline workers. Joining me today to discuss the experiences of frontline workers of color and the pathways from the front line to the middle class, and what companies can do to improve job quality and better support workers' development, Lareina Yee, Senior Partner at McKinsey Company. Welcome.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you joining me. This is an important conversation to have because there are a lot of people trying to figure out if the American dream is even possible for them. Why did McKinsey issue this report on frontline workers?
I think it starts with something you opened with. It's 112 million workers. It is a huge proportion of our working population. And how can we understand employment and advancement in workers if we're not looking at frontline workers? So at the very beginning of this, we wanted to understand what was going on. And what we found is if you're a frontline worker of color in particular, you make less and your experience day to day is worse.
And why is that?
So there are a lot of things going on in terms of wages. What we find is for actually all frontline workers, whether they're workers of color or white workers, economic mobility, the ability to advance, is particularly difficult. And if we look at frontline workers of color, Black, Latino, Asian workers, that is even more elusive. So what we find, it is not a lack of desire or ambition. In fact, close to 80% of workers of color have the desire to advance in their workplaces. And by the way, that desire to advance is higher than white workers. But here's the catch, Audrey. Less than 20% of them actually saw a promotion last year or some form of advancement in their organizations. So all of those workers with the ambition to advance aren't seeing it. And that's why you may have referenced that the American dream, it's pretty hard to achieve that. It's pretty hard to achieve that when the vast majority of frontline workers make less than $30,000 a year, and the ability to advance is very low. In fact, some people say, well, you can start at these jobs. These are just entry-level jobs, and you can go into the corporate workplace. So you might start as the grocer or the frontline retail worker, but you can make your way up to that corporate ladder. Well, guess what? Only 4% of workers of color start in the front line and actually enter the corporate workforce.
What are some of the barriers?
Yeah. So one of the things that we looked at, Audrey, is that the day-to-day experience is just not there. And so what do I mean by that? So how do you advance? One is that you have mentors and sponsors in your workplace. That's people who are maybe your managers or around you who are telling you, hey, here's what you need to do to get to the next job. That's completely missing for frontline workers of color. Two, just your basic interactions, a sense of respect, a sense of trust, those things are absent. So I'll just give you one example. You would think that DE&I, which is like diversity, equity, inclusion policies, if you're a frontline worker, you're probably pretty excited about that. But as an example, you're not. Because actually nearly 50% of frontline workers of color say that they're actually worried and fear taking advantage of those policies that exist because they think it might threaten their job security.
And they're probably right?
They may be. I mean, look, that's their perception. And as a corporation, one of your jobs is to dispel that. Because if you're offering those policies, let's just assume positive intent, you actually want people to take advantage of those. And we've seen, at least in the corporate ranks, where you have policies, people are using them in programs, it's actually making a huge dent in terms of advancement and representation of people of color and of also gender. But we don't see that in the front line. So I think one of the calls to action here is for corporations, you've been spending probably a lot of time thinking about your corporate workforce. How do you shift that spotlight to frontline workers as well and do some of the same things that you are doing in the corporate side and make sure they reach frontline workers?
And that also means that corporations are missing out on opportunities to hire qualified people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, one of the things out of the pandemic is this kind of this phrase churn and burn, that it's really hard to retain frontline workers of color. Well, guess what? If you actually work to make them more included, to make their day-to-day experience better, you might get rid of that churn and burn. You don't have to accept that. In fact, oftentimes worker of colors are changing jobs because they don't see any economic opportunity. They don't see the chance to advance to make better wages. They don't see the chance to make it out of that 30K a year that we talked about a couple minutes ago. So if you think about retention, it's a lot easier than churn and burn.
So let's talk about frontline workers. How can they empower themselves to advance their careers?
It's a great question. I mean, in this instance, you might be feeling, gosh, how do I move forward? What do I do? And my first response is, if you're a frontline worker of color, do actually hold your company to task. Find out what programs, what communities, what policies do they have. Oftentimes for frontline workers of color, you're getting the vast majority of your opportunities by advancing your skills in the workplace. You may or may not have gone to college, you may or may not have the specific skills, but you learn it on the job. So what types of education opportunities, what type of certificates, what type of ways and programs are there for you to advance? Ask your company these questions and ask your company, do you have a affinity resource group? Do you have, what do you offer? So that's the first stop. And then I think the second stop is to look for those critical sponsors in your life professionally. So that might be your direct manager, and maybe someone you identify with, but ask them, how did they get there? What tips and ideas do they have? And just remember, you're learning your skills on your job. So how do you think about those skills in terms of an investment in your career to find that next job and that next promotion?
Well, if you're a frontline worker and you want to look for that potential sponsor, you oftentimes don't have access to those upper levels, if you will. So how does someone get there? You first have to identify them, and then you have to be able to connect with them, right? So how does that happen?
No, it's a great question. So I think the idea that sponsors are someone 10 rungs more senior, I mean, sure, you might have a couple of those over time, but who's the direct person you work with day to day? And then also, who are the peers that you have in the job that you have? So look a little bit more locally to get that started. But certainly building your network over time is super important. So start with what you have kind of right next to you. Who's your direct supervisor? Who was your supervisor before? Who's the manager of your group? So that's, I think, the place to start. And look, what we see is that workers of color in the front line don't have as many sponsors, so it's not as easy. I absolutely understand that. But first is to reach out. And then secondly, we do need to demand a lot more from corporate America and bringing those sponsorship programs that have been something that they've really worked on in the corporate center down to the front line. I mean, what we want to see is that the programs that help workers advance are reaching all workers. And today we know they're not reaching frontline workers. So it's going to be a little bit of a give and take. It's not exactly perfect today. If it were, we probably wouldn't see as many people feeling this lack of economic advancement and mobility.
I'll tell you what, a great place to start is by taking a look at McKinsey Company's report and start to identify and develop those relationships for upward mobility. Where can we go for some more information, Lareina?
Sure. I mean, part of the reason for the report also is to know the facts. Understand what's around you. Understand that your experience is not just you. It's actually happening to the vast majority of workers of color. So I think that's the main takeaway from the report. But secondly, to your question, if you want to find it, you can go to mckinsey.com /race in the workplace. And we also have quite a lot more on diversity, and we hope that readers will find that interesting and educational as well.
All right. Thank you so much. My guest has been Lareina Yee, Senior Partner at McKinsey Company, and we've been talking about their new survey that details the challenges of frontline workers of color and what can be done to improve job quality and economic mobility. I really appreciate you joining me, Lareina.
Thank you so much.